Magnus Frost knelt on the frozen surface of Lake Hollow, his hand axe breaking through 6 inches of ice with rhythmic precision. Below the opening, suspended in the near-freezing water, lay 17 whitefish and lake trout perfectly preserved, as fresh as the day he had caught them 3 months earlier. 20 yards away, on the shore, Jacob Hartley and Thomas Mackenzie watched in silence, their faces showing a mixture of disbelief and something that looked uncomfortably like hunger. What those men had mocked as foolishness in autumn had become the only reason Magnus Frost would survive the winter of 1836, while they faced starvation with their spoiled provisions and empty larders. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Magnus Frost arrived at Lake Hollow on the 3rd week of September in 1836. Leading a single packhorse loaded with supplies that looked insufficient for a full winter. The established trappers working the region noticed him immediately. Strangers were rare this late in the season, and strangers traveling alone were either supremely confident or dangerously foolish. Magnus appeared to be neither. He was methodical, quiet, and deliberate in his movements as he surveyed the eastern shore of the lake, searching for something the others couldn't identify. He was a tall man, lean in the way that suggested hard travel rather than deprivation, with dark hair beginning to show gray at the temples and a beard he kept shorter than most mountain men preferred. His clothing was practical but not expensive: wool pants, a canvas coat, leather boots that had seen considerable use. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or experience in the fur trade. Jacob Hartley, who had trapped the Lake Hollow region for 4 seasons, watched Magnus from across the water and made his assessment quickly. The stranger had no trapping partner, which violated the most basic rule of wilderness survival. He carried minimal supplies, which suggested either poverty or ignorance. And he was spending his time examining the lakeshore rather than scouting beaver ponds or building a proper winter cabin. Jacob mentioned his observations to Thomas Mackenzie that evening at Mackenzie's established camp 2 miles north of where Magnus had stopped. Thomas, a Scottish immigrant who had survived 7 winters in the Rockies, was less quick to judge but equally puzzled by the stranger's behavior. They agreed to keep their distance and see what the newcomer would do. Interference in another man's camp was considered poor etiquette unless someone was actively dying. Magnus spent 2 full days walking the perimeter of Lake Hollow before selecting his location. He chose a spot on the eastern shore where a small creek fed into the lake, creating a natural depression in the underwater terrain. The location was unremarkable to anyone else: no nearby beaver ponds, no obvious game trails, no strategic advantage for defense or access to timber. But Magnus had selected it for reasons that wouldn't become apparent until much later. He began building his cabin on the 4th day, working alone with an efficiency that suggested he had done this before. The structure he built was small, barely large enough for a single man, a stove, and minimal supplies. He notched the logs competently, but without the sophisticated joinery that marked an experienced builder. The cabin was functional, nothing more. It would keep out wind and rain. That seemed to be enough for him. By early October, Magnus had completed his basic shelter and began establishing his trap lines. But his behavior remained strange to the watching trappers. He spent as much time fishing as trapping, which made no economic sense. Beaver pelts commanded premium prices at the trading posts. Fish were food, certainly, but they didn't generate income. A man who spent his time fishing instead of trapping was a man who didn't understand the business of frontier survival. Jacob mentioned this to Thomas, and Thomas shrugged. Some men came to the mountains for reasons other than profit. Maybe Magnus was one of those. Maybe he was running from something. Maybe he was just peculiar. The mountains attracted all types. The first snow fell on October 17th, earlier than usual. It melted within 2 days, but the message was clear: winter was coming fast, and preparations needed to be complete. Jacob and Thomas had already processed dozens of beaver pelts and had begun preserving food for the long months ahead. Magnus, by contrast, seemed unconcerned with the timeline everyone else followed. He continued fishing daily, pulling whitefish and lake trout from the increasingly cold water with lines and simple hooks. His cabin showed no signs of the food preservation work that should have been his priority. No smoking racks, no salting barrels, no drying frames. Either he had supplies hidden inside that others couldn't see, or he was planning to starve. Neither possibility made sense. But Magnus Frost kept to himself, acknowledged the other trappers with a nod when their paths crossed, and offered no explanations for his methods. The trading post at Bear Creek sat 12 miles south of Lake Hollow, a rough log structure that served as the commercial and social center for trappers working the region. Magnus made his first visit in late October, arriving with a modest bundle of pelts and a list of supplies written on a scrap of paper. The post was operated by Henry Blackwell, a former trapper who had accumulated enough capital to transition from catching beaver to selling goods to those who did. The interior smelled of tobacco, leather, wood smoke, and the distinctive musk of stacked pelts waiting for spring transport east. Jacob Hartley and Thomas Mackenzie were already there when Magnus arrived, conducting their own business. Magnus completed his trade with Blackwell. His pelts were decent quality but unremarkable in quantity, and purchased flour, salt, coffee, and tobacco. Then he did something that caught attention. He asked Blackwell about food preservation techniques. Blackwell, surprised by the question this late in season, assumed Magnus was inexperienced and launched into explanation. Smoking required building proper racks and maintaining consistent low heat for days, using green wood that produced heavy smoke without excessive flame. Meat or fish needed cutting into strips of consistent thickness. The process couldn't be rushed. Salting was simpler but required substantial quantities of expensive salt. Meat had to be completely covered and stored in barrels to prevent moisture and insects from spoiling it. Drying was oldest hanging meat or fish in open air, with good circulation and low humidity. Thomas Mackenzie, listening, couldn't restrain himself. He walked over and added his expertise, speaking in the thick Scottish accent that 4 decades in America hadn't diminished. He had been preserving food for wilderness winters since before Magnus was born. The methods hadn't changed because they didn't need changing. Smoking was best for large game. Salting worked for everything but required investment. Drying was acceptable for backup supplies. A man needed all 3 methods to survive proper winter. One method alone left a man vulnerable to spoilage or monotony. Variety in preserved food meant variety in nutrition, and that meant staying healthy when snow was 10 feet deep. Jacob added his perspective, warming to the subject. He described his system: smoked venison, salted fish, and dried rabbit that had sustained him through 4 winters without significant illness or hunger. The key was starting early and processing food continuously throughout autumn. A man couldn't wait until November and expect adequate supplies. The work had to happen in September and October when game was plentiful and weather cooperative. Magnus listened attentively, asked clarifying questions, and thanked them for their advice. But he didn't explain why he was asking or what his own plans were. He purchased his supplies, nodded politely, and prepared to leave. Thomas called after him, "You've got provisions laid in already, I hope?" Magnus paused at the doorway. "Working on it." "Working on it?" Jacob shook his head. "Friend, working on it should have been finished a month ago." Magnus offered a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Different methods work for different men. He left before either could respond. Thomas and Jacob exchanged glances. Henry Blackwell, who had remained quiet during the exchange, finally spoke. "That man's going to starve, or he knows something we don't." Jacob snorted. "I know which one I'd bet on." The first serious cold arrived on November 2nd. Lake Hollow's surface began forming ice along the edges where the water was shallow and protected from wind. Magnus had been fishing daily since his arrival, and his catches had been consistently good. The lake held healthy populations of whitefish and lake trout, and his simple line and hook method was efficient enough to provide more fish than he could eat fresh. On November 4th, he caught 6 large whitefish in the space of 3 hours. It was far more than he could consume before spoilage set in. Magnus had watched the ice forming along the shoreline with particular interest. It was still thin, perhaps half an inch thick, but it was solid and growing thicker each night as temperatures dropped. He stood on the bank, holding his string of fish, and made a decision that was part practicality and part curiosity. He walked to where the ice met open water, used the handle of his knife to break a hole, and submerged 4 of the fish beneath the ice. He weighted them down with a rock tied to the stringer and left them there. It wasn't a plan, so much as an experiment. He had nothing to lose. The fish would either keep or they wouldn't. 3 days later, Magnus returned to the spot. The ice had thickened to nearly 2 inches. He broke through with his hand axe and retrieved the stringer. The fish came up cold, stiff, and completely preserved. There was no smell of decay, no softening of flesh, no discoloration. They looked exactly as they had when he had submerged them. Magnus carried them back to his cabin, thawed one by his stove, and cooked it. The taste and texture were identical to fresh-caught fish. Not similar, identical. Magnus sat at his small table, eating the fish and thinking through the implications. The water temperature beneath the ice was hovering just above freezing. Cold enough to prevent decay, but not cold enough to freeze solid. The ice itself protected the fish from scavengers and provided easy access with minimal effort. No smoking required, no salt expenditure. No drying racks or weather dependency, just cold water, ice, and the simple physics of temperature preservation. He spent the next week testing variables. He submerged fish at different depths, shallow water near shore, deeper water farther out. He tried different methods of weighing them down. He experimented with how long they would keep. Every test produced the same result. The fish remained perfectly preserved as long as they stayed submerged in the near-freezing water beneath the ice. The lake itself was acting as a massive natural cold storage, and the ice provided both protection and accessibility. By mid-November, Magnus had refined his method into a system. He caught fish daily and stored them in an underwater cache he could access through ice holes he maintained. He marked the locations with subtle signs, stones arranged in patterns only he would recognize. He used woven baskets weighted with rocks to keep fish organized and easy to retrieve. The system required effort, breaking ice, managing the cache, maintaining access points, but it worked flawlessly. Other trappers occasionally saw him on the ice with his axe, breaking holes and pulling up fish. They assumed he was simply fishing more frequently than made sense. None asked what he was actually doing. November progressed with steadily dropping temperatures, and the lake ice thickened from 2 inches to 6. Magnus devoted his mornings to trapping and his afternoons to perfecting his underwater storage system. What had begun as simple experimentation evolved into a carefully engineered operation. He wasn't just storing fish randomly beneath the ice anymore. He was building infrastructure that would sustain him through an entire winter. The first challenge was organization. Retrieving fish from a single pile beneath the ice was inefficient and risked damaging the catch. Magnus solved this by creating multiple cache points spread across a 100-yard section of shoreline. Each location held a weighted basket woven from willow branches. The baskets kept fish separated and protected while allowing cold water to circulate freely. He could access individual caches without disturbing others, and if one location became problematic, he had alternatives. The second challenge was marking. Snow would soon cover the lake's surface, making cache locations invisible. Magnus created a marking system using natural landmarks, a distinctive boulder on shore, a dead tree leaning at a particular angle, a slight rise in the terrain. He memorized the relationships between landmarks and cache points, creating a mental map that required no physical markers. To an outside observer, there was nothing on the ice to indicate anything beneath it. The third challenge was depth. Too shallow and fish might freeze solid when extreme cold arrived. Too deep and accessing them through thick ice would become prohibitively difficult. Magnus experimented and settled on 8 to 10 feet as optimal. The water temperature at that depth remained stable. The distance was manageable for weighted baskets on ropes. And the ice thickness overhead, even in the coldest months, wouldn't exceed 4 feet in this region. The fourth challenge was access maintenance. Ice holes refroze overnight once temperatures dropped below zero. Magnus developed a routine of checking his primary access points each morning, breaking through the new ice layer before it became too thick to manage easily. He kept 3 main access holes active and knew the locations of 7 backup points if primary access became blocked or damaged. By late November, Magnus had stored 43 fish in his cache system. He continued catching and adding to the supply while eating fresh fish daily. His diet remained varied and nutritious while he watched smoke rising from neighboring cabins where trappers were processing meat over fires that burned continuously. The work they were doing was visible, understood, and traditional. The work Magnus was doing was invisible, unconventional, and largely unnoticed. Thomas Mackenzie saw him on the ice one afternoon, kneeling beside a hole with his hand axe nearby, pulling up a basket dripping with ice water. Thomas was checking his own trap lines and paused to watch. Magnus retrieved 2 large whitefish, returned the basket to the water, and covered the hole with loose snow. Thomas shook his head and continued walking. He assumed Magnus was fishing with some unusual technique. It never occurred to him that those fish had been under the ice for 2 weeks. The cache grew throughout December. Magnus added fish almost daily. By the winter solstice, he had 78 fish stored in baskets beneath the ice, enough protein to last until spring thaw if necessary. The trading post gathering on December 19th was better attended than usual. The first major winter storm was approaching, and trappers were making final supply runs before weather made travel dangerous. Magnus arrived mid-morning with pelts to trade and a process to short list of necessities. The post was crowded 7 trappers in total, including Jacob Hartley and Thomas Mackenzie. Conversations overlapped as men discussed trap yields, weather predictions, and the usual complaints about prices for both pelts and supplies. Henry Blackwell was tallying Magnus's trade when Jacob spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Frost, you get your winter provisions sorted out yet, or are you still working on it?" The question carried an edge of mockery that made others look up from their own business. Magnus finished his transaction before answering. "I'm managing well enough." Jacob exchanged glances with Thomas. "Managing how, exactly?" "I've been past your cabin 3 times this month. Never seen smoke racks. Never smelled meat curing. You hiding supplies we can't see?" Magnus kept his tone neutral. Different methods work for different situations. Thomas moved closer, genuinely curious now rather than merely skeptical. "What methods?" "You can't live on fresh game all winter. Nothing stays fresh in a cabin. It freezes or it rots." Magnus considered his response carefully. He had known this conversation would happen eventually. "The lake stays cold enough to preserve fish. I keep them in the water under the ice." The room went quiet for 3 long seconds. Then Jacob laughed a sharp bark of disbelief. "Under the ice? You're storing food under the ice?" Another trapper named William Crenshaw, who had been silent until now, joined the laughter. "That's the stupidest thing I've heard all season. What happens when the ice gets 3 feet thick? You going to chop through 3 feet of ice every time you want supper?" Magnus remained calm. "The ice doesn't change the water temperature. Fish stay preserved. Access is manageable with an axe." Jacob was shaking his head, grinning widely now. "Listen to yourself. You're going to spend half your day breaking ice just to get food that you could have smoked properly in October. That's not innovation, friend. That's just being stubborn and foolish." Thomas, more measured but equally doubtful, posed a practical question. "What about January? February? When it's 20 below zero and there's 4 feet of ice and you're burning energy, you can't afford to burn just to reach food? What then?" Magnus met his eyes steadily. "Then I'll break through 4 feet of ice if necessary. The fish will still be good." William Crenshaw slapped his knee. "He's serious. He actually thinks this will work." Jacob turned to Henry Blackwell. "Henry, you're a witness. When Frost shows up here in February, half-starved and begging for food, remind him we tried to warn him." The laughter continued as Magnus gathered his supplies and left. Behind him, he heard Jacob's voice carry through the open door. "Ice fishing for food storage. I've heard everything now." The storm that had been threatening arrived on December 22nd and lasted 3 days. Snow fell continuously, accumulating 2 feet on level ground and drifting considerably higher in exposed areas. Temperatures plummeted to 15 below zero at night and barely reached zero during daylight hours. Lake Hollow froze completely, the ice thickening rapidly under the sustained cold. By the time the storm cleared, the ice measured 28 inches thick, too thick for casual travel, but solid enough to support a man's weight safely. Magnus waited until the morning after the storm ended to check his cache system. The wind had scoured some areas of the lake nearly bare, while creating massive drifts in others. His landmark-based navigation system proved effective. He located his primary access points without difficulty, though all were buried under varying depths of snow and refrozen ice. He used his hand axe methodically, first clearing snow, then breaking through the new ice layer that had formed over his previous access hole. The work took 20 minutes of steady effort. When he finally broke through, the dark water beneath was exactly as he had left it, cold, still, and just above freezing. He pulled up one of his weighted baskets. The fish inside were perfect. Firm flesh, clear eyes, no deterioration whatsoever. He took 2 large whitefish, returned the basket to the water, and packed loose snow over the hole. The entire process, including breaking through the ice, took 35 minutes. He was back in his warm cabin within an hour of leaving it, with fresh fish ready to cook. 20 miles away, Jacob Hartley was eating smoked venison for the 4th consecutive day. The meat was edible but monotonous, and the smoking process had been imperfect. Some pieces were too dry, others retained too much moisture and were developing mold that had to be cut away. He had salted fish as backup, but the salt quantities he had purchased weren't sufficient for his entire supply. Some of the salted fish was already questionable. He would eat it because wasting food in winter was unthinkable, but it wasn't appetizing. Thomas Mackenzie's situation was similar. His food preservation had been more successful than Jacob's decades of experience had taught him exactly how long to smoke meat and how much salt to use. But even properly preserved food became tedious. Smoked elk tasted like smoked elk, whether you ate it in December or February. Dried rabbit was sustenance, not enjoyment. He had variety in the sense that he had multiple types of preserved meat, but everything carried that same smoked or salted flavor that dominated the actual taste of the meat itself. Magnus, by contrast, ate fish that tasted identical to fresh caught. He varied his cooking methods, fried in bear fat one day, baked near the coals another, boiled into stew with the vegetables he had stored. The fish itself was unchanging in quality. Only his preparation varied. His nutrition remained excellent. His energy levels stayed consistent. He wasn't merely surviving winter, he was eating well during it. The ice continued, thickening throughout January. Magnus adjusted his routine, but never questioned whether the system would work. February arrived with temperatures that hadn't risen above zero in 12 consecutive days. The ice on Lake Hollow had reached its maximum thickness, 42 inches of solid frozen water that required significant effort to penetrate. Magnus had adapted his routine to account for the increased work. Breaking through now took 45 minutes of steady chopping, but the fish beneath remained as perfectly preserved as they had been in November. His cache held 31 fish, more than enough to last until spring thaw. Jacob Hartley's situation had deteriorated significantly. The smoked venison he had relied upon as his primary food source had developed problems. Mold had spread through nearly a quarter of his supply despite his efforts to store it properly. He cut away the affected portions, but the remaining meat was questionable in both safety and palatability. His salted fish had fared worse. Inadequate salt coverage and improper storage had allowed spoilage to begin. He had been forced to discard 8 pounds of fish that had become inedible. His dried rabbit was nearly exhausted. By early February, Jacob was rationing food and calculating whether his remaining supplies would last until spring. Thomas Mackenzie had managed his preservation better, but even his experience couldn't prevent the inevitable degradation that came with months of storage. His smoked meat remained safe to eat, but had become so desiccated that it required extended soaking before cooking. The nutritional value was diminished. The taste was barely tolerable. He supplemented his diet by setting snares for rabbits and ptarmigan, but winter hunting was unpredictable and energy-intensive. Some days he burned more calories checking trap lines than he gained from his catches. William Crenshaw's situation had become critical. He had underestimated his food needs and had relied too heavily on a single preservation method. His dried meat supply was exhausted by mid-January. He had transitioned to eating his seed corn and emergency flour supplies, food that was meant for spring planting and cooking, not primary sustenance. By February 10th, he was facing genuine hunger. His body was consuming its own muscle mass. His energy levels were dangerously low. He needed protein, and he needed it consistently. Other trappers in the region were experiencing similar problems to varying degrees. Winter food preservation was never perfect. Spoilage, miscalculation, inadequate supplies, improper storage, or simple bad luck created shortages that ranged from inconvenient to life-threatening. The traditional methods everyone relied upon had inherent weaknesses that became apparent during extended winters, and this winter was proving longer and colder than most. Magnus remained unaware of the difficulties others were facing. He maintained his isolated routine, checking his cache every third day, retrieving fish as needed, and living comfortably in his small cabin. The effort required to access his food had increased substantially, but the food itself remained unchanged. He ate well, while others struggled. His health remained excellent, while others weakened. On February 14th, Thomas Mackenzie made a trip past Magnus's cabin and saw smoke rising steadily from the chimney. He saw Magnus outside, chopping firewood with the easy movements of someone who wasn't rationing energy. Thomas continued past without stopping, but the observation lingered. That man should be struggling like the rest of us. Jacob Hartley arrived at Magnus Frost's cabin on February 21st. He had lost considerable weight since December, and his movements carried the careful slowness of someone conserving energy. Magnus was inside when he heard the knock, an unusual sound in the winter wilderness, where visitors were rare and usually unwelcome. He opened the door to find Jacob, standing in the snow, gaunt-faced and hollow-eyed. "Can I come in?" Jacob's voice was quiet, stripped of the mockery that had characterized their last conversation. Magnus stepped aside without speaking. Jacob entered and stood near the stove, absorbing heat. The cabin smelled of cooked fish. On the table sat the remnants of Magnus's midday meal, whitefish, fried golden, with boiled turnips on the side. Jacob stared at the food with barely concealed hunger. Magnus poured coffee and handed Jacob a cup. They sat in silence for several minutes before Jacob spoke. "I heard you've still got food." Magnus nodded. "I do." Jacob looked at the fish remains on the table. Fresh fish. In February. It wasn't a question, but Magnus answered anyway, from the cache. "Under the ice." Jacob wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I thought that was foolishness." "We all did." Magnus stood, walked to his storage area, and returned with 2 large whitefish frozen solid from being stored in his unheated shed. He placed them on the table. "Thaw these by your fire tonight. Cook them tomorrow. They'll taste fresh." Jacob stared at the fish, then at Magnus. "Why would you help me? I mocked you. In front of everyone." Magnus sat back down. "You were wrong. That doesn't mean you should starve." Jacob's throat worked as he struggled with pride and necessity. "I can't pay you. I've got nothing worth trading." Magnus waved the concern away. "I'm not asking for payment." The silence stretched again. Finally, Jacob asked the question that had been building. "How does it work? Really?" Magnus explained the system in detail. The water temperature beneath the ice remained constant near freezing. Fish submerged at the right depth stayed perfectly preserved for months. The ice protected them from scavengers and provided access with an axe and effort. The baskets kept everything organized. The landmark system prevented losing cache locations under snow. It was simple physics and careful planning. Nothing magical, nothing complicated. Jacob listened with the intensity of someone hearing information that might save his life. "And it really works? Through the whole winter?" Magnus gestured at the fish on the table. "You can see that it does." Jacob picked up the frozen whitefish Magnus had given him, feeling the weight and solidity. "Could I do this? Next season?" Magnus nodded. "Anyone could. You just need to start in autumn before the ice gets too thick. Build the cache while access is easy. Then maintain it through winter." Jacob stood slowly, holding the fish carefully. "I owe you more than I can repay." Magnus opened the door. "You don't owe me anything. Just remember this when someone else needs help." Jacob stepped out into the February cold, carrying food that would keep him alive and knowledge that would change how he survived every winter thereafter. Spring arrived gradually, beginning with temperatures that occasionally rose above freezing during midday and ending with the complete breakup of lake ice in early April. Magnus had survived winter in better health than he had entered it. His cache system had performed flawlessly. He had eaten well, maintained his strength, and never faced the desperation that had plagued other trappers. When the ice finally cleared, he retrieved his remaining baskets and inspected them for wear. They had held up remarkably well. He could reuse them next season with minimal repairs. The trading post gathering in late April was larger than usual. Trappers emerged from winter isolation, eager for human contact, news, and the business of selling pelts accumulated over the cold months. Magnus arrived with his modest bundle and found the post crowded with familiar faces, most notably Jacob Hartley, who had regained some of the weight he had lost and looked substantially healthier than he had in February. Jacob saw Magnus enter and immediately walked over. Their interaction drew attention. Everyone remembered Jacob's mockery from December. Seeing him approach Magnus now, with an expression that contained no hostility, created curiosity. Jacob spoke loud enough for others to hear. "I owe you an apology, a public one, since I mocked you publicly." The conversation in the post quieted. "You were right about the ice cache. It works. It kept you healthy all winter while the rest of us struggled." Thomas Mackenzie, who had been examining new traps near the counter, turned around fully. "The ice storage actually worked? Through the whole winter?" Magnus nodded. "Never had a single fish spoil. Water temperature stays consistent. As long as you can break through the ice, you can access fresh food." William Crenshaw, who had barely survived winter and looked skeletal even now, stepped closer. "How much effort? Really?" Magnus considered the question honestly. "More than smoking or salting up front. You're building infrastructure and maintaining access. But the food quality never degrades. And you're not dependent on salt supplies or perfect smoking conditions?" Thomas asked. The practical questions, depth requirements, basket construction, marking systems, ice thickness management. Magnus answered each thoroughly. He had no reason to keep the information secret. The technique wasn't complicated. It just required understanding principles that hadn't been obvious until someone tested them. Henry Blackwell listened from behind his counter, recognizing the significance of what was happening. Knowledge that improved survival spread quickly on the frontier, because survival mattered more than pride or proprietary claims. By the time the gathering ended, every trapper present understood the basic concept of underwater cold storage. Over the following weeks, word spread beyond those who had been at the trading post. Trappers mentioned it to partners. Partners described it to others at different posts. By autumn, Magnus's technique was being discussed across the entire Lake Hollow region. Some men dismissed it as too much work. Others recognized it as genuinely innovative, but everyone knew about it. When September arrived and trappers returned to their winter territories, Magnus noticed something different. 3 other cabins were being built along Lake Hollow's shoreline. Men who had trapped elsewhere were relocating to access the lake's natural cold storage potential. They asked Magnus for advice, and he provided it freely. By autumn of 1837, the landscape around Lake Hollow had changed. 7 cabins now dotted the shoreline where previously only Magnus and 2 others had wintered. The new arrivals came specifically for access to underwater food storage. They had heard the stories, confirmed the details, and decided the technique was worth adopting. Magnus found himself in the unexpected role of informal teacher, demonstrating basket construction, explaining optimal cache depths, and sharing the hard-won knowledge he had accumulated through trial and error. Jacob Hartley built his cache system with meticulous care, remembering the hunger that had driven him to Magnus's door the previous February. He started in early September, giving himself ample time to establish infrastructure before ice formed. Thomas Mackenzie, more cautious by nature, created a hybrid system, maintaining his traditional smoking and salting methods, but adding an underwater cache as supplementary storage. Even William Crenshaw, who had nearly starved, relocated his operations to Lake Hollow and began building baskets under Magnus's guidance. The technique spread beyond the immediate region. Trappers working other lakes in Montana and Wyoming heard about the method through the informal communication networks that connected frontier communities. Some tested it on a small scale, others committed fully. The approach was modified and adapted based on local conditions, different lake depths, different ice thickness patterns, different fish species. But the core principle remained constant. Cold water beneath ice provided natural refrigeration that preserved food indefinitely without salt, smoke, or drying. Magnus watched this spread with quiet satisfaction. He had never intended to revolutionize winter survival. He had simply solved a personal problem using observation and logic. But the solution had proven valuable enough that others adopted it voluntarily. No one paid him for the knowledge. No one needed to. Information that saved lives was shared freely because frontier survival often depended on collective knowledge rather than individual secrets. The winter of 1837 to 1838 proved the technique's reliability across multiple implementations. All 7 trappers at Lake Hollow maintained successful caches. Food quality remained excellent. Nutrition stayed consistent. The health outcomes were noticeably better than previous winters. Word of this success spread further. By 1839, underwater cache systems were being used at lakes throughout the northern Rockies. Magnus himself continued trapping for 3 more seasons before leaving the mountains in 1840. He had accumulated modest savings and felt ready for a different life. He moved to Oregon Territory, purchased a small farm, and transitioned from wilderness survival to agricultural stability. He married in 1842 and started a family. His children would never know the mountain man existence he had lived. He rarely spoke of those years. They were simply part of his past, neither glorified nor regretted. But the technique he had developed outlived his time in the mountains. Into the 1850s and beyond, trappers and settlers living near cold water lakes continued using underwater cache systems. The method became standard practice in appropriate locations, mentioned in journals and letters as an accepted survival technique rather than an innovation. Magnus Frost's name faded from the story. The frozen fish cache simply became something that worked, a practical solution that required no attribution because it had been absorbed into the collective knowledge of frontier survival.